It was supposed to be a fresh start, a quiet life away from the chaos of the city, where car alarms and sirens played a nightly symphony. I had saved every penny I could and bought a modest home in a rural stretch of Tennessee, miles from anyone or anything. The house was a fixer-upper, with creaky wooden floors and windows that didn't quite close all the way. But I didn't care. It was mine. I could breathe out here, surrounded by fields and forests instead of smog and concrete. The first few weeks were bliss. I spent my days painting walls, mowing the overgrown lawn, and sitting on the porch, sipping coffee while watching the sunset over the distant hills. It wasn't until my 4th week in the house that I noticed the truck. It was an old, beat-up Chevy, dull red paint peeling off in strips. I first saw it parked a few hundred yards down the dirt road that led to my property. It didn't move for hours. I thought maybe someone had broken down. When I went to check, the truck was gone. Over the next few days, the truck kept reappearing, always at different spots on the road, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. I never saw anyone get in or out, just the truck, sitting there, like it was watching me. One night, I decided to stay up and keep an eye out. I'd had enough of the guessing games. I made a pot of coffee and positioned myself at the living room window, shotgun resting across my lap. Midnight came and went. Nothing. Then around 2 a.m. I saw headlights slowly creeping down the road. The truck stopped directly in front of my driveway. My pulse quickened as I crouched lower behind the window, peeking through the gap in the curtains. A man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He didn't have a flashlight. Just stood there, staring at my house. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering my address into the receiver. The dispatcher assured me an officer was on the way, but out here the nearest station was miles away. It would take time. Too much time. By the time I glanced back out the window, the man was gone. The truck, too. It was as if they'd vanished into thin air. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside my front door. Large, heavy boots. They led from the driveway to my porch and back again. I called the sheriff's office. A deputy named Charlie showed up a couple of hours later. He was friendly but dismissive, chalking it up to some local kids playing pranks. He promised to patrol the area more frequently, and left. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the old house made my skin crawl. Around 3 a.m. I heard it, a soft scratching noise like fingernails dragging along wood. It was coming from the back door. I froze. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it might burst. Slowly I crept into the kitchen, shotgun in hand. The scratching stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then, the door handle rattled. I flicked on the porch light and yanked the door open, aiming the shotgun into the dark. No one was there, just the empty fields, stretching out under the pale moonlight. The next day, I installed deadbolts on every door and nailed the windows shut. I even bought a security camera system, though the spotty internet out here made it practically useless. Still, I needed something to make me feel safer. For a few nights, nothing happened. I started to think maybe it was over. Maybe whoever it was had gotten bored and moved on. But then came the banging. It was just past midnight when it started. Loud, furious pounding on the front door like someone was trying to break it down. I jumped out of bed, grabbing my shotgun and phone. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911 again. The dispatcher's voice was calm, too calm, as she told me to stay on the line. I shouted into the receiver, begging her to send someone now. The banging continued, relentless and violent. Then it stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. I stood there, holding my breath, listening, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Inside the house. I backed into the corner of the bedroom, aiming the shotgun at the doorway. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving closer. My throat was dry, my hands slick with sweat. "I'm armed!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Get out of my house!" The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of my ragged breathing. Then, a low, raspy voice spoke from the hallway. "You can't hide." The word sent a jolt of terror through me. I pulled the trigger, the shotgun blast echoing through the house. The recoil knocked me back, and I scrambled to reload. When I looked up, the hallway was empty. I didn't sleep that night. When the sun finally rose, I found my front door wide open, the lock shattered. There was no blood, no sign of anyone having been there. Just the lingering stench of sweat and dirt. The sheriff came again, this time with 2 deputies. They searched the house and the surrounding property but found nothing. They suggested I might have imagined it, that stress and isolation were playing tricks on me. But I knew better. Someone had been in my house. Someone who wasn't afraid of locks or guns. I thought about leaving, selling the house and going back to the city. But I didn't have the money to start over again. So I stayed, barricading myself inside as the days turned to weeks. Then one night, the power went out. It was pitch black, the kind of darkness where you can't even see your own hand in front of your face. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the void. That's when I saw it, a figure standing in the corner of the room, just outside the flashlight's reach. I screamed, the sound raw and guttural. The figure didn't move. I raised, the flashlight higher, the beam revealing a man's face. It was the same man from the truck. His eyes were cold, empty. He smiled, a slow, cruel grin that made my stomach churn. And then he lunged. I don't remember much after that, just flashes, the shotgun going off, a struggle, pain, and then silence. When I woke up, it was daylight. The man was gone, but the house was in shambles, furniture overturned, walls gouged with deep scratches. Blood, mine or his, I wasn't sure, splattered across the floor. The sheriff's office came again, but this time, they didn't bother to hide their skepticism. They looked at me like I was crazy, like I'd done this to myself. That was months ago. I've stopped calling. The police, I know they won't believe me. I've stopped sleeping too, afraid of what might happen if I let my guard down. The man hasn't come back, but I can feel him, watching, waiting. Every night I sit in the corner of the living room, shotgun in hand, staring at the front door. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. Out here in the middle of nowhere, there's no one to hear you scream. And I've learned the hard way that monsters are real. They don't live under your bed or in your closet. They drive old trucks and wear flannel shirts, and sometimes they find you, no matter how far you run. My name is Emily Clark, and I used to love the sound of the wind through the pines. Growing up in a small town nestled deep in the forests of Oregon, that sound meant home. But now, it only brings dread. It's been 3 months since I came back, and I still can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I moved away to escape the suffocating familiarity of life here, but when my mother passed suddenly, I returned to settle her affairs. She left me her cabin, a modest place, tucked at the edge of the woods. It was supposed to be temporary, just long enough to clear out her belongings and sell the property. But the moment I stepped back into that cabin, something shifted. Memories came rushing back. Christmas mornings by the fireplace, her laughter, echoing through the rooms. Selling it felt wrong. I decided to stay. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my days sorting through her things and my evenings curled up with a book, letting the quiet envelop me. But then, small things started to feel off. Doors I knew I had locked were suddenly ajar. Items I was sure I'd left on the kitchen counter would be moved to the living room. At first, I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness, grief playing tricks on my mind. But then came the scratches. They appeared one morning on the back door, deep grooves etched into the wood as though something had tried to claw its way in. I examined them closely, my stomach churning. They weren't random. There was a pattern, almost deliberate. I told myself it must have been an animal, maybe a bear, though I knew how unlikely that was. Still, I replaced the door's flimsy lock with a sturdy deadbolt and tried to move on. It happened late one night, as the forest outside was blanketed in darkness. I had just finished a glass of wine and was heading to bed when I heard it. A faint creak on the front porch. My blood ran cold. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. There it was again, Slow, deliberate footsteps. Grabbing the largest kitchen knife I could find, I crept toward the door. Every muscle in my body tensed. I peered through the peephole, but the porch was empty, just shadows dancing in the moonlight. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. Then the sound came again, this time from the back of the cabin. I turned off the lights and moved to the kitchen, where a small window overlooked the backyard. My breath fogged the glass as I leaned closer, trying to see into the darkness. And then I saw him. A man, standing just at the tree line, partially obscured by the shadows. He wore dark clothing and a hood, his face hidden. In his hand, he held something long and gleaming. My stomach lurched as I realized it was a knife. I stumbled back, clutching the handle of my own knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind raced. I grabbed my phone only to find the signal had dropped. Of course, out here that was common, but now it felt like a death sentence. The landline had been disconnected years ago. I was alone. The footsteps started again. Slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. The man was testing the windows, rattling them lightly as if to check for weaknesses. I crouched behind the kitchen island, trying to steady my breathing. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear. "Yeah, go away," I whispered, though I knew he wouldn't. The footsteps stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. I peeked over the edge of the counter, and that's when I saw the doorknob turning slowly. The deadbolt held, but it wouldn't for long. Panic surged through me. I had to do something. Adrenaline took over. I grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove and positioned myself near the door, knife in one hand, skillet in the other. The door shook violently as the man began to force his way in, the wood splintering under the strain. The deadbolt finally gave and the door flew open. He stepped inside, his hood still shadowing his face. He was tall, his presence menacing. Without hesitation, I swung the skillet with all my strength, catching him in the shoulder. He stumbled, back grunting in pain, but he didn't fall. He lunged at me, the knife in his hand glinting in the dim light. I barely dodged, the blade grazing my arm. Pain seared through me, but I didn't let it slow me down. I slashed at him with my own knife, the blade cutting through fabric and skin. He roared in pain, but he was relentless. We grappled. The fight, brutal and chaotic. He pinned me against the counter, his knife inches from my throat. I could smell his sweat, feel his breath hot on my face. Desperation gave me strength. I kneed him hard in the stomach, forcing him to loosen his grip. I grabbed the skillet again and brought it down on his head with all my might. This time, he went down. I didn't wait to see if he was unconscious or dead. I ran. Barefoot and bleeding, I sprinted into the forest, branches tearing at my skin. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest road, where a passing truck finally brought me to safety. The police found the man hours later, still in my cabin. He was a drifter with a violent history, wanted for multiple assaults. They told me I was lucky to be alive, but I didn't feel lucky. I felt violated, broken. My cabin, once a place of comfort and love, was now tainted with blood and fear. I sold it and moved far away, but the memories followed me. Every creak of a floorboard, every shadow at the edge of my vision sends me spiraling back to that night. I sleep with a knife under my pillow now, though I pray I'll never have to use it again. But deep down, I know I'll never feel safe. Not truly, the pines used to sing to me. Now they whisper a single haunting truth. I'll always be looking over my shoulder. My name is Sofia Alvarez, and I was 22 when I made the worst decision of my life. Born and raised in Buenos Aires, I had always dreamed of seeing the world. California, with its beaches, endless highways, and promise of freedom, seemed like the perfect escape. I had saved for months to fund a road trip through its wilderness, eager to leave behind the noise of the city and my suffocating life back home. But dreams have a way of twisting into nightmares. The trip started fine. I rented a small SUV, packed a few essentials, and set off to explore the state. The redwoods, the coastal cliffs, the desert. Each stop was more breathtaking than the last. But as the days went on, I found myself craving something more remote, more authentic. That's how I ended up on the Desolation Trail, an unmarked dirt road winding through a forgotten corner of Northern California. It wasn't on any map I had, but a local had mentioned it in passing, calling it untouched paradise. The road was rough, and after an hour of bouncing over rocks and dodging tree branches, I began to regret my choice. The forest here was dense, the kind of place where the sun struggled to reach the ground. My GPS had long stopped working, and my phone had no signal, but I told myself it was fine. This was what I wanted: solitude, adventure, freedom. By the time I found a clearing to set up camp, the sun was already setting. The air was cool and the silence was absolute. I pitched my tent, started a small fire, and sat back to enjoy the stillness. For the first time in years, I felt truly alone. No one to judge me, no expectations to meet. It was liberating, until it wasn't. The first sign of trouble was subtle, a faint rustling in the bushes just beyond the firelight. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But then I noticed the pattern. The sounds weren't random. They moved in a slow, deliberate circle around my camp. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Nothing. Just the crackle of the fire and the steady rustle of leaves. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and shone it toward the trees, but the light seemed to dissolve into the darkness. My heart pounded as I scanned the forest, my imagination conjuring shadows that weren't there. I tried to shake off the fear, convincing myself it was all in my head. But as the night deepened, the noises grew louder. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. They stopped just outside the circle of light, as if whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be seen. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the fire with a knife in one hand and a flashlight in the other, jumping at every sound. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up and left, vowing never to camp alone again. I drove aimlessly for hours, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and that cursed clearing. The road grew narrower, the forest thicker. I should have turned back, but something compelled me to keep going. I told myself I'd find a motel, a diner, anywhere with people. But the farther I drove, the more I realized there was nothing out here, just trees and silence. Then my car broke down. It happened without warning. One moment the engine was humming along, the next it sputtered and died. I cursed and tried the ignition again, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I got out and popped the hood, though I had no idea what I was looking for. The air was heavy, the kind of oppressive silence that makes your ears ring. That's when I saw it, a figure standing in the trees just beyond the road, tall, motionless, watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. It was too far away to see clearly, but I could tell it wasn't an animal. It was human, or something that looked human. I reached into the car for my flashlight and shone it toward the trees, but by the time the beam hit the spot, the figure was gone. I slammed the hood shut and got back in the car, locking the doors. My mind raced as I tried to think of what to do. There was no signal, no one around for miles. I considered walking back the way I'd come, but the thought of stepping into those woods... No, I'd stay in the car and wait for daylight. But as the hours dragged on, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The shadows outside the windows seemed to shift and move, shapes emerging and disappearing in the corners of my vision. And then, just as the last light of day faded, the knocking started. At first it was soft, almost polite. A gentle tap on the driver's side window. I turned, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. Then came another knock, louder, on the passenger side. I shone the flashlight, but again, nothing. Knocking grew more insistent, moving around the car, the back window, the roof, the doors. It was everywhere, surrounding me. I gripped the knife in one hand, the flashlight in the other, my breaths coming in shallow gasps. "Leave me alone," I screamed, my voice cracking. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a voice. Low, guttural, and inhuman. "You don't belong here!" I screamed and slashed at the air as the driver's side window shattered, glass raining down on me. A hand reached in, pale and clawed, grabbing at my arm. I stabbed blindly, with the knife feeling it connect with something solid. The hand recoiled with a guttural snarl, and I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I threw open the passenger door and ran, the forest swallowing me whole. Branches tore at my clothes and skin as I stumbled through the darkness, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. Behind me I heard the footsteps, heavy, relentless, and far too close. I don't remember how long I ran. Minutes, hours, it didn't matter. All I knew was that I couldn't stop. Not until I burst into a clearing and saw headlights. A truck was parked on the side of the road, its engine idling. I ran toward it, screaming for help. The driver, a grizzled man in his 50s, looked at me like I was crazy, but he let me in. As we sped away, I looked back and saw them. Figures standing at the edge of the forest, their eyes glowing in the darkness. Watching. Waiting. I never went back to the Desolation Trail. I don't tell people about what happened either. They wouldn't believe me, but sometimes in the dead of night I hear it again, the knocking. And I wonder if they're still out there waiting for me to come back. It was supposed to be a getaway. Just me, the open road, and the kind of solitude that only the middle of nowhere could offer. After months of working long hours in the city, I needed the quiet. My plan was simple. Rent a cabin deep in the Alaskan wilderness, far from cell service and crowds, and spend a week rediscovering myself. No distractions, no stress, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional crackle of a campfire. The drive to the cabin was serene at first. The highway stretched endlessly, flanked by dense forests blanketed in snow. The sun hung low in the sky, its pale light casting an ethereal glow over the landscape. It was beautiful, almost surreal, like stepping into a postcard. But as the miles wore on, the beauty gave way to an unsettling stillness. The roads were empty, the forest too quiet. By the time I reached the turnoff for the cabin, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving me in the grip of a frigid Alaskan night. The cabin was exactly as advertised, small, rustic, and isolated. It stood alone in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. A thin layer of snow covered the roof, and the single window emitted a soft, warm glow from the porch light I'd turned on remotely. I parked the car and unloaded my bags, the crunch of my boots on the snow the only sound in the still night. Inside, the cabin was cozy but sparse. A small wood-burning stove stood in one corner, a worn couch and coffee table in another. The kitchen was little more than a counter with a sink and a mini-fridge, and the bedroom was just big enough for a bed and a nightstand. It was perfect. I lit the stove, poured myself a glass of wine, and settled in for my first night of peace. Peace didn't last long. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow outside. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but the steps were deliberate, heavy, too heavy for a deer or a fox. My heart pounded as I strained to hear, every nerve in my body on high alert. The steps stopped just outside the cabin. Then came the knock, 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the door. I froze. Who could it be? I hadn't seen another car or person for miles. My nearest neighbor was 10 miles away, and there was no reason anyone would be out here in the middle of the night. I crept to the window and peered out, but the porch light illuminated nothing but falling snow. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. Just the wind and the faint creak of the porch under unseen weight. Then, another knock. I grabbed the poker from the fireplace and stood by the door, my breath shallow and quick. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. Still, no answer. I didn't open the door. Instead, I backed away and locked myself in the bedroom, the poker clutched tightly in my hand. The knocking stopped, but I didn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every whistle of the wind set my nerves on edge. When morning finally came, I found the porch empty. But in the snow, I saw them, boot prints, leading from the woods to my door and back again. The next day I convinced myself it had to be a lost hiker or some kind of prank. But the unease lingered, a shadow I couldn't shake. I spent the day chopping wood and exploring the area, trying to distract myself. The forest was eerily beautiful, its silence almost oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though every time I turned around, I saw nothing but trees and snow. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was setting. I bolted the door and checked the windows twice before settling in for the night. I kept the poker by my side and a flashlight within reach. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was restless and filled with strange, vivid dreams of shadowy figures and distant whispers. I woke again to the sound of footsteps, but this time, they weren't outside. They were inside the cabin. Panic surged through me as I bolted upright, clutching the poker. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving from the kitchen toward the living room. My heart thundered as I listened, every muscle in my body frozen with fear. I strained to see through the darkness, but the dim light of the dying fire revealed nothing. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. Silence. Then the footsteps started again, heading toward the bedroom. I fumbled for the flashlight and shone it toward the door, but it was closed, and nothing moved beyond it. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I held my breath, waiting for the knob to turn, for the door to creak open. But nothing happened. The silence stretched on, oppressive and deafening. When I finally gathered the courage to open the door, the cabin was empty. The only sign that anyone had been there was the faint smell of smoke and the poker lying on the living room floor, though I was certain I'd left it by my bed. By the third day, I was unraveling. Sleep-deprived and paranoid, I considered packing up and leaving, but a stubborn part of me refused. This was my retreat, my chance to escape the stress of my life. I wouldn't let fear ruin it. That night, I lit every light in the cabin and kept the fire roaring. I locked the doors, barred the windows, and kept my phone and poker within reach. But none of it made me feel safer. As the hours dragged on, the shadows seemed to creep closer, the cabin's walls pressing in on me. Around midnight, the lights flickered and went out. The fire sputtered, plunging the cabin into darkness. I grabbed the flashlight and poker, my heart racing. The footsteps started again, this time accompanied by a low, guttural laugh. It echoed through the cabin, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What do you want?" I screamed, my voice breaking. The laugh grew louder, more distorted, until it was a deafening cacophony. I backed into a corner, swinging the poker wildly, but the sound didn't stop. Then, as suddenly as it started, it was gone. When the sun rose, I didn't wait. I threw my things into the car and drove away, the cabin disappearing into the rearview mirror. But even as I left it behind, the fear stayed with me, a constant presence in the back of my mind. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know this. Some places are meant to be left alone, and the middle of nowhere is one of them. The last place I ever expected to find myself was on the outskirts of civilization, where even the GPS couldn't guide me. My name is Claire Hartman, and I'm a freelance journalist specializing in crime stories. I thought I'd seen it all: urban violence, fraud, corruption. But nothing prepared me for what I found in the forgotten town of Ridgewood. I was investigating a string of disappearances. Over the last decade, nearly 24 hikers and campers had vanished without a trace in the Ridgewood National Forest. Locals had their theories: bears, accidents, even ghosts, but none of it added up. Bodies were never found, and the police seemed too underfunded, or perhaps too uninterested to dig deeper. When a young woman named Julia Grayson became the latest victim, her desperate family reached out to me. She'd never just wander off, her sister sobbed over the phone. "Please, Claire, you're our only hope." I arrived in Ridgewood, just as the sun dipped below the mountains, casting long shadows over the dense pines. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decay. My lodging was a rundown motel on the edge of town, The receptionist, a gaunt woman with hollow eyes, handed me the key without a word. Her silence was unnerving. That night I pored over my notes and maps. Julia had last been seen at a trailhead leading into the forest. She'd texted her sister a photo of the towering redwoods just hours before her phone went dead. Something about the image bothered me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The next morning, armed with a flashlight, a pocket knife, and an old map of the trails, I ventured into the forest. The trailhead was deserted, save for an old rusted car parked haphazardly near the entrance. Its windows were smashed, and the interior was littered with garbage and torn fabric. The sight sent a shiver down my spine. The forest was eerily quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of leaves, just an oppressive, unnatural stillness. As I ventured deeper, I began to notice strange markings on the trees. They looked like symbols, carved crudely into the bark. Circles, lines, and what appeared to be jagged arrows pointing deeper into the woods. My unease grew with every step. After hours of hiking, I stumbled upon a campsite, or what was left of it. A tent lay shredded, its fabric flapping in the breeze. The ground was littered with personal items, a torn backpack, a cracked phone screen, a single hiking boot. But what caught my attention was the blood. It was dried now, staining the leaves and dirt in dark, rust-colored patches. I took photos, my hands shaking. This wasn't an animal attack. The blood spatter was too deliberate, too human. As I turned to leave, I heard it. A faint whisper, almost indistinguishable from the wind. I froze, straining to hear. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Help me." I spun around, my flashlight slicing through the gloom. The forest was empty. My pulse thundered in my ears as I scanned the area, but there was no one. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. Still, I quickened my pace, retracing my steps back to the trailhead. But the whispers followed me, growing louder and more urgent. As dusk fell, I found myself hopelessly lost. The trail markers had disappeared and the forest seemed to close in around me. That's when I saw it, a faint glow in the distance. Desperate, I followed the light until I came upon a dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned, its windows shattered and its roof sagging under the weight of years. But the door was ajar, and candlelight flickered inside. I approached cautiously, gripping my pocket knife tightly. The air was thick with the stench of rot. Inside, the cabin was a nightmare. The walls were covered in more of those strange symbols, drawn in what I prayed wasn't blood. Chains hung from the ceiling, their purpose horrifyingly clear. In the center of the room stood a table, and on it lay something that made bile rise in my throat. A human jawbone. Footsteps sounded behind me. I spun around, but it was too late. A figure loomed in the doorway, silhouetted against the dying light. He was tall and wiry, his face obscured by a mask fashioned from animal bones. In one hand he held a knife, its blade glinting with menace. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and guttural. I didn't wait for him to make the first move. I lunged, slashing wildly with my pocket knife. The blade nicked his arm and he let out a growl of pain, but he was fast, faster than I expected. He knocked me to the ground, the wind rushing out of me as I hit the floor. The knife clattered out of my hand. He loomed over me, his blade poised to strike. Desperation surged through me. My hand found a shard of broken glass, and I drove it into his thigh with all the strength I could muster. He screamed, stumbling back and giving me just enough time to scramble to my feet. I ran. Branches tore at my clothes and skin as I plunged blindly through the forest. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices urging me to keep going. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't dare stop. Finally, I burst onto a dirt road where a passing truck screeched to a halt. The driver, an elderly man with kind eyes, helped me into the cab and drove me to safety. I told the police everything, but when they searched the forest, they found no cabin, no symbols, no jawbone, only my bloodied pocket knife. The man in the mask was never caught. I left Ridgewood the next day, vowing never to return. But the memories haunt me, At night, I still hear the whispers, soft and insistent, as if the forest is calling me back. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever truly escape, and sometimes I'm not sure I want to. Out there, in the middle of nowhere, I found the story I was looking for, but it came at a price I'll never stop paying. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button to help support the content you love. Your support means the world to us and helps keep the channel going. Don't forget to check out the video that's playing on your screen right now. There's more spine-chilling content waiting for you. Stay tuned for more stories, and if you haven't already, hit that notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay safe and stay spooked.